Ah, okay. We're recording. Good.
Sorry about that.
So no worries, man. Okay, so today we'll take a look first at the comparison of the two architectures. How is Boomi as a platform generally designed, and how is Mulesoft as a platform? How do they work? What are their components, etc.? A very simplified version because I just want to focus on the core components that you will use on a regular basis, or with Boomi are using already. We'll then look at developing a process and how that would work in each of the tools. We'll take a look at mapping data and how that varies between Boomi and MuleSoft, what the options are. A quick look at adding custom code. We're not going to write Java code and do it today, but we'll have a look at how that's possible. We'll look at process storage and sharing because it's done quite differently between again, philosophically between the two platforms. And a quick look at security and management because we have only, about 45 minutes of total time. I want to leave a little bit for questions and answers as well. So this will be kind of fast. Little introduction into what we plan at this point for this series. So the second part of this course, of course, is going to be the other part of MuleSoft for Boomi developers. And there we're actually going to build a simple API in both platforms. I chose API simply because that's MuleSoft's core competency and something that if you move into the MuleSoft world, you'll be working with probably a lot more than you're working with in Boomi. And we'll compare the techniques of how you build and what one does better than another and so forth. We have a couple of technical deep dives prepared for the future. The first of those is going to be on performance management, and Somya will be delivering that one. And then a deep course in data weave. It's one of the most important components of MuleSoft, and understanding it and figuring out how it works and where to use it and so forth is quite important. Sharantan will be presenting that one. We'll also look at some implementation examples. We're going to take a look at what's called the Catalyst program for MuleSoft, which is a very, very thorough set of APIs and implementations and so on for a vertical. I believe right now it's retail, healthcare, and possibly a third one. But we'll go into those in deeper detail. And then we're also in the process of building an internal MuleSoft process exchange. And we're going to model that on the processes that have been created in the Slalom Boomi account. We'll translate a lot of those into MuleSoft. We'll put them in Exchange and make them available for folks that way. And then finally, what do you guys want to see as you go forward, as you start to work with MuleSoft, as you start to study it? What would you like us to add to the course? Are there specific deep dives you'd like to go into? And are you interested in presenting? If you've had some experience or you're developing some experience and you'd like to share something, either a particular implementation with a client or just some thorny problem that you solved, we would be happy to add other sessions and other folks. Okay, so the only slides that we're going to really have is this comparison of architectures group. Otherwise, we're going to just be doing walkthroughs. So Boomi, ultra simplified Boomi, as you can see. Boomi, as we know, is an iPaaS and therefore lives primarily in the cloud. And so since it's a law that whenever you talk about the cloud, you have to use that particular shape, there it is. The core components to Boomi, and of course there's lots more detail to this, but the primary things that we work with are the IDE, the little orange side over there, and that is fully hosted in the cloud, as you know if you've spent some time. It's not something you download and run on your desktop. The repository, which is entirely managed by Boomi, it tracks versions. I'm sure most of you have worked with a version at one point or another. If we haven't, we'll probably take a little quick look at that too. The deployment pipeline, again, totally managed by Dell. And their method of sharing various parts of code and so forth is the process library. I won't go into that a bunch today. If you've done some of the Boomi training, you'll either have run into that or you will shortly. Then there are some optional components, and they include, and probably the biggest ones, API management. So there's a full API management suite. There's also a Dell course on that as well for Boomi. There's a master data hub, which is essentially their implementation of MDM, or master data management. There's Boomi Flow, which is a graphical interface for creating business workflows and also of tying those into Boomi integrations. And then finally an EDI component, so the electronic data interchange, which is really a B2B component. I believe we've not run into that a lot in our customer base. Also optional is the Cloud Atom. For integrations that are purely one cloud application to another, so it doesn't touch anything that exists within the client network, you can use a Cloud Atom. And that is just the core Atom deployable, hosted by and managed by the Boomi folks. You have some options. You can, when I say managed by, it's just meaning it as a managed service in the sense that you also have management capabilities for it. The other option to that is what I'm calling here on-premise, but that also includes, of course, private VPCs, anywhere that the client would actually own the rights to the system on which the Atom would be displayed. And of course, the Atom itself, which is the core runtime. We'll see that there's a slight difference between that and Mule as we go to the next slide. So is everyone pretty comfortable with that? I mean, I think everybody's worked with most of these components at one point or another or have studied it. Any questions or thoughts there that we need to add? Okay. Then I'll move over to Mule. Slightly different. Mule 2 is cloud-based, obviously. It's another iPaaS. And it consists of essentially the core grouping of components, which are a mix of cloud items and desktop, I'll call it for the moment, or Windows or whatever application. It's actually a Java app, so you can run on anything. But the platform itself includes several different cloud components, the first of which is called the Design Center. That's an online application for creating APIs, for creating simpler data flows from one place to another. It's a little bit more focused on API creation and management, and also on, at least from Mulesoft's standpoint, more of a citizen integrator. So it's not quite as heavily developer-centric. It's a little more graphical. However, in the real world, I think it's probably not so easy as they're trying to say, although they make improvements in it all the time. So we'll look at Design Center briefly too. We'll look at that in real depth in our next Boomi for Mulesoft. They have a security manager, which is platform-wide, and is kind of similar to Boomi's in the sense that you can manage the users within the organization, and it applies to APIs and so on. But you can also plug it into external authentication methodologies, which you can also do with Boomi SSO as well. And there's also a management center, which is similar to the API management component in Boomi. One of the largest differences is they have a completely separate application and entry point for their product called Exchange. And that, let me see if I can go backwards here one without a problem. Am I? There. Similar in concept to the process library. Different kind of execution though. This is a complete, almost standalone application that you can use for several things. One, of course, is sharing processes. You can do that internally or externally. You can consume Mulesoft created resources like specialized connectors for, I've noticed their SAP and all sorts of other third-party applications. You can keep reusable components that you're developing for your own organization in there as well so that you can share them more easily. As a matter of fact, Exchange is what we'll be using to publish all of those kind of interesting integration items that have been created in Boomi that we will migrate to Mulesoft. Thirdly, and perhaps more importantly, if you publish a Mule API that you've created in the Design Center, publish that directly to Exchange, you automatically get a full portal for that particular API, so that you have a developer access point. It gives you the design elements, it gives you a testable API front end, and a mock built for the back end. So you can actually allow people to, click on the get button and see what happens, or click on put and pass in something. It's quite useful and a little bit easier to work with than the API manager in Boomi by comparison. The two other parts of Anypoint Platform are not cloud specific. The core item is the Mule runtime, and that is roughly equivalent to the Atom in the Boomi world, in that it is a Java application that kind of combines all of the elements that you will deploy to it. Where it's a little bit different from the Boomi Atom is that it doesn't have to communicate with the mothership. So if you ever set up an Atom before, you know that an on-premise or local or VPC Atom will actually communicate with Boomi to download whatever particular items you deploy to it, right? So that's an active part. With the Mule runtime, you're actually deploying through a traditional CI/CD pipeline, or through the hidden CI/CD pipeline that's in Anypoint Platform. From there, if you can build an API there, and you can also deploy that to the Cloud Hub, which is their version of the online application. So it's a Mule runtime that is in a managed service called Cloud Hub. Or you can create your own CI/CD pipeline. So in this case, you don't have the built-in repository. Let me step back just one second. If you're going to work with Anypoint Studio and Set, which we will of course look at today, that is an actual Java application that is an Eclipse plugin. If you've done Java development before, you're probably familiar with Eclipse as an IDE. And you develop that application within the confines of the IDE. You then deploy using a build tool called Maven. And you pass the build results into whatever CI/CD pipeline that you're going to use. You can build your own from scratch and eventually have it deployed to a Mule runtime somewhere on premise. You can also, from a development standpoint, and I didn't actually put this on here just to try to keep it a little cleaner. When you're working with Anypoint Studio, you'll have a local Mule runtime on your machine already. So you don't have to install an Atom and then have it communicate again with Boomi. You can actually deploy directly from Anypoint Studio to your local runtime. That still uses Maven internally, but you'll probably skip that whole CI/CD pipeline thing, right? Because if you're just developing, you just want it to be quick and easy. And a lot of it actually happens in the background. I'll show you the button. There's essentially a one-button deployment kind of thing that you can do. So any questions there before we continued? Does everyone feel fairly comfortable with that?
I have just a quick question. I'm wondering which part of the native functionality here in the architecture surrounds the monitoring piece. I think that's one of the biggest reasons why the local runtimes communicate with the platform, is so that the platform is the source of truth for integration monitoring. So I'm just curious where here that occurs in the Mulesoft architecture.
Got it. There's a couple different places, actually. One of those is in Management Center. That gives you the item right over here, the management. Whoops, sorry about that. I clicked on that. The Management Center application gives you insight into Cloud Hub and all of the runtimes there. You can also, and anybody, if I say this wrong, correct me, you can also plug in on-premise and other Mule runtimes into the management center. Or you can tap the APIs. If I remember correctly, I think TC did something along that line with one of our clients a few years back. Or he actually used the Mulesoft API to do some monitoring and logging.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
That is correct.
Am I remembering that right, TC?
Yep. Built kind of a custom application to manage and monitor the Atom queues, as well as manage the starting and stopping of processes that exist on Cloud Hub, because Cloud Hub only allows you to stop and start processes at the time. And I still think that that's the case today. They still don't have the ability to stop individual flows via the runtime, but that does exist when you'd have an on-prem deployment.
Right. And obviously using like Elk or Splunk or something, yeah.
And always remember one thing too, everything in the Mulesoft world is an API. They are API first in every way that you can possibly think of. They push you toward the concept of building everything in layered APIs, and their entire application is just one big API. So if they offer that, you can consume it and do whatever you want with it. So it's kind of flexible. And of course, Boomi, you can do the same thing.
Cool.
Excellent. Other questions? Okay. Well, from here on out, it's just going to be walkthroughs. So I'm going to get out of the... Oh, there's so many things going on here. To get that out of the way. Oh, well, I guess it doesn't want to go out. All right. So let's instead talk about how do I do something in Boomi. Let's first take a look. I don't think Pete's will mind my showing a little bit of this. I'm not going to give you any proprietary information or whatever. Just want to look at this from a standpoint of how we tend to structure processes, what our best practices are. We tend to try to separate the beginning of a process from the actual implementation. One, for several reasons. It's easier to debug, but it is also easier to test, because now I can tap in directly to a sub-process and stay away from having to actually invoke that initial create. So every Boomi process starts with a start shape, right? And there are 3 different choices. It can either be a connector of some sort, a data pass-through, or no data. So how do I start a process in Mulesoft? First of all, Mulesoft refers to processes as a flow. And another difference in structure, Boomi, everything is a process. So if you build an API, you are building a series of processes that are going to be focused around an HTTP listener. With Mulesoft, you will actually tend to build the front end as a separate API component that you are building through the designer, and then you will build processes that support that API. And the initial, instead of calling it a start step, it's called a trigger. And a trigger is a little bit more event focused than a typical Boomi start. So if we look at something like this, this particular one, by the way, I borrowed these just from the Mulesoft introductory course. I haven't created anything special here. So if you want to see it, it's easy enough to grab these. This is a general connector. And the trigger is anytime a file is new or updated. So kind of a 2-step thing. We have to connect to something, and we have to have an event that goes with it. So kind of like in the JMS listener in Boomi, for example, we've got an actual listener connector, and then we've got the operation on the connector. So here we think of that more as an event. However, one thing that's different is that we can also connect to things like the scheduler. Again, in Boomi, we have a separate schedule that is assigned to a deployed process. Here, we can assign a scheduler as an actual start item and make it the event that kicks off a process. and then it will walk through the various events or the connectors or whatever it is that you're doing in between. So that's a start. So again, it's similar to Boomi. We have usually some kind of connection, and we have some kind of event, which is equivalent roughly to the connector operation. Mapping. In Boomi, jump back over here. Whoops. In Boomi, we have a map shape, right? Well, I guess we'll have to open one here that has one. There we go. So we have a map, and in that map, we have the ability to graphically have a source and destination, and we can plug in functions in between. I'm sure everybody's probably done that by now. In Mulesoft, we use a transform component. Similar in concept, but very different in execution. And did I pick a good one here? No, let me pick a good one that has some information in it. Do it. There we go. So this, a transform component, is actually where you invoke the data weave language. And on one part, it is similar to Boomi in that there is a graphical interface that you can use, and you can actually, pick and choose the items between. Whenever you assign a source or a destination, with Boomi we use a profile. And with Mulesoft, we can use any kind of component to be an input or an output. We can define a profile style thing using JSON or using a Java POJO. It's a regular Java object where we can create a data type, and we can use that as part of the mapping. So similar in concept again. Where it's very different is that there's an actual language as opposed to just having the graphical input. This is data weave language. Looks kind of similar to JSON, but it also has a lot of functionality kind of plugged into it. I'm not going to go into all the super details of this. We're going to have a course on it simply because it takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of knowledge. But you can see, you can actually write it here, and it will appear graphically over here. Okay, so we've got a problem with the script on that one that has to be fixed. But anyway, as you can see, we've got something going on over here. We've got a JSON array coming in, and we can map individual pieces to that. And if we didn't have a problem in this one, we have an error. So we're not returning something that we need to see. But that's kind of handy. We have a little bit of instantaneous error feedback. So that's a very super quick look at data weave. There is far, far more to this than what I'm showing you here. So a map relatively equals to transform component. How do we log? How do we log specific things that we want to? Well, in Boomi, thing just gets in my way all the time. I try to move that. If we've got, yeah, okay. In Boomi, we tend to use a notify shape, and we can pass to it whatever kind of information we want to send. Like this one, very simple. This passes the current data into a logging mechanism so that you actually get that in the process log. In the Mulesoft world, we use instead a logging component. And move that again. You'll find that you use this a lot during development. The logger interface is actually built into the IDE. So instead of having to go to the management and then process reporting, segment in Boomi, you'll actually have access to it in your development environment. They do that by using the, I forget what it's called in Eclipse, but it's a different way of showing the components. So you'll have different views. One will be for development, one would be for, what are the two they offer up here that I'm seeing? There's one for debug and one for design. So we're in the design right now, so we have access to all those shapes and so on that we want to use. If we jump into debug, and I won't do that now because I haven't actually started something, we'll actually have access directly to the log. So let us look a little bit deeper into this one. This is the default appearance that you'll find that comes out of the box with the Eclipse plugin, and it's focused on the message flow. However, there are two other views that you can easily switch to. The first of those is a global element view, and global elements roughly correspond to process properties in Boomi, except in this particular case, they are truly global. You can obviously create global process properties, but you can also create local process properties in Boomi. Here we've got a special area that's already designed for global. Now, of course, there's not going to be any operation on here, so if instead we look at the individual elements, we can either create these through here, which gives us a graphical look at each of these elements. And let me see, I'll click edit so you can have a look at what it is. So you can create whatever it is that you need here. We can use variable substitution, similar to the concept of environment extensions in Boomi. We can actually use variables here and then set up a process for replacing those appropriately in different environments. Or we can actually edit the configuration XML. Obviously very, very different from Boomi. There's no place that we do this. And all of this reflects in here. So if I make changes to a message flow through the configuration XML, it will actually appear here in the graphical interface as well. So if you're one of those folks who really likes to torture themselves and write XML by hand, you can go for that. I'm going to scroll through a little bit to give you an idea. There's an awful lot going on there, as you can see. Okay. I wanted to open it up here because I had requested before this presentation if anybody could send anything they'd like to ask about how do I do something in Mulesoft. I'd like to open it up for any questions that anybody might have that they didn't submit. I based what I've done so far on what you've sent me. Oh no. Okay, well, I'll add a few on myself then. The various items that you can use with Mulesoft, connectors and so on, is called the palette in the Mule world. It is, again, roughly equivalent to the, let's see, where do I need it? Here we go. Roughly equivalent to whatever this is called. I guess it's just the shapes bar in Boomi. So you've got in Boomi, of course, we've got shapes to do various things. We have logic that we can implement, and of course we have a list of connectors that are available to us. So similarly, in Mule, we also have the full palette. By default, they only show some of the real basic things, like search and exchange. We mentioned exchange earlier. We can actually search through it to pick up something that we've created that we want to share, and it'll plug the entire thing into our project for us. We can add code modules. We've got the Mulesoft core elements, which are part of the runtime. So if we look at, I'm going to do that for a minute, you can see there are lots of different things. These are similar in concept, I guess, to a lot of the shapes and so on. So we can do things like creating batch jobs. Got all sorts of things that are part of the, I guess some of this is logic, some of it, so it's organized. I guess what I'm getting at is it's organized differently from Boomi, so you kind of have to get used to where you find things. They break it up instead by different categories. So they've got the component section, which is kind of what you build in between the start and the end of a given process. We've got the scheduler endpoint. That's the only one that's offered as an endpoint out of the box by the core Mule runtime. We've got a little bit more error handling by comparison. So there's some things that are already built into Mulesoft that we kind of tend to build by hand or build that would for a specific client or whatever. That gives you some things you can do, and again, sort of Java facing, right? We've got the error handler itself. You've got the ability to continue or propagate or just raise a general error. So those should look pretty similar too. Flow control, I'll come back to in just a minute. There's a concept here that is again something we don't do in Boomi that's called the scope. And scopes sort of give you programming concepts. So we can have asynchronous, which I think should be probably fairly self-explanatory, right? We're not going to wait for a response. We've got a cache, so that very similar to Boomi and how that behaves. There's the flow itself, which is called a subflow reference. Within Boomi, we call that what's that called? A process. Let's see, it's up here in the execute. It's called the process call, where we call a sub-process. In Mule, we call that a process reference. And it actually, you can reference any other kind of process. There's no particular way that it has to be structured. We've got for each the capability to work its way through. So kind of similar to breaking up a document into multiple documents in Boomi. Try, like the try catch. You can also do something called the until successful, which lets you create a loop that keeps trying something until it's successful. So that's kind of self-explanatory, I guess, too. Very handy if you have an asynchronous process that you are concerned about the reliability of the source. And then I won't worry about this. This is some transformers that you can use in concert with DataWeave. What I think is a little more interesting is the flow control. The first is the easy one. That's choice, and that is just the same as the logic decision component in Boomi, right? So if I want to look at something and make a decision, I would do that through the choice. One thing that Mulesoft does offer that's slightly more flexible is I can choose between more than one particular outcome. So kind of combination between the decision point and a route, sort of built together. Then they also have an interesting one, or one that I found interesting. I haven't found a use case for it yet personally, but the first successful. So you can actually do a similar concept to the process route that we use in Boomi, but it has a little extra logic built into it. So if you want to try to do something, and if you have multiple possible places that you want to send that data. So, I don't know, it could be sending it to different queues or whatever the case may be. And if you want it just to go down whatever the very first process that it runs that actually works, you can use the first successful routing. Kind of cool if you have stuff that is less important and you don't have an absolute path that it has to follow, and instead you can have some options, or if you have a situation where you are using multiple duplicate endpoints for failover purposes. So the first successful is hand in hand that way. There's also two different kinds of routers called a round robin and a scatter gather. I'll let you go through the Mulesoft training to go through that. That's a little bit more complex than what we have time for today. Although I want to show you really quickly the choice so that we can see the difference between this and the Boomi. Oh, oops, I didn't mean to do that, but anyway. As you can see, the choice itself, come on here. There. Wanted to get that come up. The choice itself has its own structure. We can add to the choice any kind of metadata that we've made available. So if we've added some data types, we can also add payloads, and a payload is pretty much the same, similar or almost identical to the document concept in Boomi. So it is the actual data that you are passing through the process. We have variables available here, which are more like programming variables, multiple scope, and multiple types of variables. And then we can also use attributes as well and add those anywhere to the choice. And then we create as many paths. There is no limitation to the path. So if we think of this as kind of a combination, like I said, between decision and route. So the decision is made, we can route it down one path or another. You can create a default path so that you have what happens if it doesn't meet any of the choice criteria. We have a default. So sort of like a switch statement, right? So that's kind of cool. I like that one because it's a little bit easier to implement than it is with Boomi. I find it a little bit limiting to be able to have to make a choice on one single kind of data input. Let me see. Yeah, I think we've got pretty much the same kind of thing throughout all of this. There's not anything else I want to cover. Is there anything that anybody else has any curiosity about? Have you seen anything here that didn't make any sense? Or
It looks like the log seems to be in place of what Boomi used for a stop shape. Is there a difference between this logger here in Mulesoft and what you typically can use in Boomi?
Sure. Yeah, there is no actual stop shape in Mulesoft. There's just kind of the end of the process is this right line, kind of, so to speak. So we don't actually put an end in there. You can log if you want to, but you'll also notice in here that you don't have to actually do any logging at all. You can end it with any particular process that you want to, and that output will be available. So similar in concept to a return documents in Boomi, any process will return whatever that last item is. If you've ever programmed in Ruby, you know the last statement you make in a Ruby class just returns whatever it is that you're working with, whatever data or whatever properties.
Gotcha.
So you don't have to be limited to putting an end space anywhere. And again, you don't have to log anything. It's strictly for convenience.
Okay.
And I also should mention, I'm glad you asked that. I should mention too that there's a special section on each of the processes for error handling. So you've actually got a separate, so you can build an error handling process that you can reuse for multiple processes, and just simply by plugging that into the error handling flow, or you can build a specific flow that works with a given process flow.
Yeah, just to add on to that, Wayne, one thing to the last comment, think of any flow within the Mule is a part of an API, right? So the flow can be, you can have sub flows, you can have multiple flows to decouple your entire API functionality. But think of an API like from a distributed tracing standpoint, you might need to add your own loggers, everything, so that you can trace the API end to end. Mule doesn't provide out of the box, which can say, hey, this is the start and this is the end of the API, right? So it's all depend on the designer, how they get their API designed.
Gotcha.
Excellent point. Thank you. Other
Hey, Wayne,
questions?
Wayne, this is Chirantan. Maybe
Hi,
you could give
Sharon.
an overview of the Anypoint platform, talking about Cloud Hub. That way, other folks can get an idea of what an API manager is, what a runtime, and how do you deploy apps like that.
You bet. I'm actually going to take a look at that next. I also wanted to mention, I'm glad you brought that up, because I did want to mention before we get too far away from this, to show that you can essentially add just about anything that you want to from a Java application standpoint. It gives us a wee bit more flexibility. We're not limited to a specific programming language, as in, mostly we use Groovy or JavaScript to create functions. Here we can write anything that you can write in Java, you can add to the project, just like adding any other jar.
Cool.
I'll also mention briefly that Mulesoft has its own M-unit testing framework. So it's based on the concepts of X-unit or J-unit, so that you have a little bit more structured way of testing your actual individual chunks or individual processes. As most of you have probably implemented, we test our Boomi processes by isolating a particular section and then mocking up something that we enter into the process to test it end to end. So this gives you a little more freedom. We'll talk about M-unit in another session later on, since we are a little bit short on time for that. Okay, well, if everybody is ready, we'll move over to the web and have a look at the Anypoint platform interface. And again, we'll do this pretty quickly. We'll do a lot more with this when we get to the next Boomi Mulesoft for Boomi developers, because we'll actually build something in here. But the Anypoint platform is made up of several different components, like we saw in the graphic. There is the Design Center, Exchange, and then the Full Management Center, which gives us several different types of management capabilities. I'm going to start with the Design Center. Login expired. Well, it kicked me out. Well, that wasn't nice of them. There we go. Okay. Go back to Design Center. This gives us the opportunity to create several different types of components. So if we take a quick look at the create, we can actually build a Mule application here. And that is done using a more graphical interface. And it's aimed a little bit more at people with less technical knowledge and more business knowledge. We can also import any kind of Mule application that we've created on our Anypoint Studio. We can also work with APIs. We can start with either an API spec or a fragment, which is really just a part of an API spec, so that you can build things again in a sort of componentized fashion. I'll look just briefly at one of these. Here's an API spec that one of the folks in Slalom put together. And the first thing you'll notice is that it uses not Swagger, but RAML. It also does have the ability to import OAS, which is the new name for Swagger. But what you'll find is that it also converts that from OAS to RAML anyway internally, because essentially all of these are built on top of that. So there's the general structure. And it'll look pretty familiar. If you've ever done Swagger, it looks really familiar. Kind of similar between the two. You can add to it things like, there's a JSON example that you can use as a payload for a particular endpoint. Not sure what he's got there. Not a whole lot. You can build examples. You can build the fragments. We kind of looked at that before as pieces. So if you have there's a small part of an API, and you can combine these to create overall APIs. So these are different chunks. Makes it a little bit easier to read, I think, than having to have the whole thing in one big Swagger definition. And I don't remember what traits are, to tell you the truth. I've forgotten. We'll look and see. Yeah, well, looks like. Okay, so these look like responses then, basically, for the various HTML return codes. So that's an API design segment. You can also build in here. Let me go back to there. And you can build Mule applications. A lot of people probably recognize, let me just pick one of these. A lot of folks have been doing their training. We'll just look at oh, that was the API spec, sorry. Go back here. Let's find something that's done a Mule. Here we go, American Flights app. So this is the Flow Designer. And similarly to the Anypoint Studio, you essentially build this piece by piece using a triggering event and then followed by, why is this one? Triggering event followed by the same kinds of things. So in this particular case, you've got a triggering events and HTTP listener. This is an API, so that makes sense. We have an operation. In this case, we're doing it with what they're calling the get flights, which is really just doing a get to this initial HTTP. And you can also add transformations. There is a data weave interface built into the web app as well. Sorry about this, the network is a little bit slow here today.
And you could export this flow and import it into your Anypoint Studio.
That's correct. You can go in both directions. And from the, I think it's in the management component, you can deploy to either the cloud version, the Cloud Hub, or you can deploy to your local, your on-prem or VPC. Mule runtime as well, both from the web. Wow, this is really going a lot faster earlier. See if it's at least picked up the input and output yet. No, not yet. Well, my apologies, but this looks very much similar to what we looked at in Anypoint Platform. It's just a web-based representation of the same thing, representation of data weave. And of course, in there we also had an input and an output, and then we had the mappings between those. We also can add actual data types. And we can build the example. We looked at the example, we saw that list of examples earlier, and we can simply either do that, so we have an example already built, so we can import it using that, or we can build it from our own schema that we put together right here in the window, or copy and paste, either way. And this gives you, this little preview over here is the way that it'll look in either Anypoint Studio or if you're looking at the data weave transformation.
So in the IDE development environment, you can develop some pretty complex, I guess, integrations and that call other integrations and things like that. Are you able to do the same thing in the design center?
Practically speaking, not really. The design center is focused on more straightforward combination of components. For example, you can actually import your API definition into the design center and use it as one of the cards in there.
Right.
So it's really not designed to be super flexible like Anypoint Studio is.
Okay, so it's a little more. You can still do things like, I mean, you're doing HTTP calls. There's other connectors in here that can be added to the canvas, right?
Correct.
But you just can't get as complex as
exactly
Studio.
So, but you can actually, you can do a pretty good job with it. So, for example, all I did was click the plus button as the next item in line. It will add a card for us, and it gives us a choice of application-based connectors, pretty much the same as the list that we have down in the Anypoint Studio. So these will look pretty familiar. Or we can actually grab our published API from here. This is kind of the thing that really that is very useful, is if you want to take several of your internal APIs, let's say you want to take a couple of system APIs and build build an experience API. That's actually you don't do that. I'm sorry. System goes into the middle layer and then API. So you want to build an experience API. You can actually pick anything that you've published in the Exchange from here. So there's all kinds of stuff. And of course, you can grab other published ones as well. You can see there's all kinds of things done here. And you can choose there's the list of components. So where you're really limited here is you can't do as much from this particular point as you can with Anypoint Studio. I can reference another flow. I can use the for each. I can create a logger. We've got the variable and payload items. We've got transformation, and we can do try catch. So it gives you a reasonably flexible front end, but nowhere nearly as, how shall we say it, as universal as the Anypoint platform, the Anypoint Studio. Good question.
Yeah, I mean, I've done the training for the fundamentals. So one thing that wasn't clear to me was what's the purpose of the design center if it's not meant to replace Studio?
Well, from Mulesoft's stated objectives, the design center is aimed at less technical individuals. And this is you can read that right on the Mulesoft website. This is focused on enabling more people in the organization to be able to build workflows. Or, well, I guess I should say data flows. These aren't really workflows, they're data flows. That's Mulesoft's stated objective to it.
Mainly for the business users with less technicalities and complications within the API.
Right.
So
good example. Let's say you are a designer of the API for your mobile one of your business's mobile applications. You are quite likely not kind of a full-blown developer, but you would like to be able to grab a lot of those middle-tier APIs and bring the data together and have some sort of outcome and build a final API, for example. Or you may just need to get data from one place to another, and the concept behind this is to take some of the work off the Mulesoft developers. It is definitely not a complete replacement for Anypoint Studio.
Thinking from other standpoint, like let's say if you're a mobile developer or some sort of developer having expertise not on Java or IDE, I think it's more easy for you to utilize the design center rather than installing Anypoint and your API as soon as developed in the design center.
That certainly makes sense too. There is also, let me see here if I can find it. I think I bookmarked it.
Hey Wayne, I did just also want to time check on 1 o'clock.
Oh yeah, we're getting there. I'm sorry, I haven't looked lately. Oh,
No,
I'm
no
sorry,
problem.
we're at 101. My apologies. Well, I will just briefly then show this to everybody, and I guess I could email this link out. This is a new presentation on the Mulesoft website that gives a lot of insight into how they see their various workflows. So it gives you some insight into what part of it should be done in the designer, what part should be done in the Anypoint Studio, who would be likely to, what's the typical use case for using the designer. It's really well done. It's not very long. It's 31 minutes, I think, something along that line, and very nicely narrated. So I will. Since you have the attendee list, can I just email this to you, Andrew?
Yep, I can email that, any other links that you want, and then I'll also shoot out a link to this recording with the SharePoint, just
Great.
to make sure anybody else
Thank
can have
you.
it.
I'll
Yep.
also put this on the deck as well because I'll give you the link for the deck as well. But for right now, I'll just send you this because people might be interested in this one. It kind of goes further than what I did in explaining some of the use cases for the various components.
Cool.
So I apologize for taking extra time. I know it was kind of a lot to try to squeeze into an hour. And I'll just remind next time we'll actually build something and we'll use the sort of, how shall I say it, the Mulesoft recommended way, and we'll build the same thing simultaneously in Boomi, just so we can compare how I would do kind of a simple API.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you, everybody, so much. I appreciate your time. And as always, feel free to send me questions, whatever. If they're ones that I can't answer, I will make sure that I find you somebody who can.
Thank you, Wayne.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Yeah.
Thanks.